Hey artists, get your watercolor palettes because we are going to talk about the ins and outs of how to use watercolor to create a nice gradient or a value scale for our monochromatic landscape project. You're going to need your watercolors, and you can use the paintbrush that is in your watercolor set. That would be pretty helpful. If you have other paintbrushes, I would recommend that you use a flat brush. This will help for really nice even color application for today's exercise. However, if you don't have these, that's okay. Use the paintbrush provided in the art kit. You'll need some water, and you'll also need a paper towel or some toilet paper or something to wipe your brushes off on. When working with watercolor, you need to dip your brush in the water and then dip your brush in the color of your choice. And this wakes the paint up so that the pigment is activated, and this allows us to apply color to our paintings. As you can see, I am dragging my brush across just to get a feel and to also show you how the watercolor naturally has a gradient or value scale as the pigment starts to fade and the water becomes the only thing that's left in the brush. And I would encourage you to do this just as a warm-up with whatever brush you're using today to get a feel for how the paint is held and how it leaves the brush the more that you drag it across the paper. It's really neat. It is its own value scale. However, we are going to be applying watercolor to a larger piece of paper or larger areas, so we need to practice getting value all in a large space, and we can't just rely on dragging the brush across the paper to fill in our whole artwork. So let's go ahead and take our drawing pencil and let's sketch out a value scale, and we'll divide it up into 7 sections so that we can practice layering our colors to build a value scale in watercolor. So I'm going to take my paintbrush that I'm using and I'm going to dip it in water, and then I'm going to touch the green to activate the pigment. And I'm going to apply this first layer to our box that will eventually be our shadow. And then I want to get a feeling for the green to get lighter as we move through the scale. So I'm going to drag my brush just to establish what my goals are for the medium tones of green in the middle, and then as they get to be lighter green, working towards the white that we'll leave for the highlight in our value scale. Watercolor is all about layers. So I'm taking my brush and I'm going to fill in the second value next to what will be the shadow, and it does appear to be the same shade of green as the one we just applied to our dark value on the left. That's okay. We will be layering on top of this with multiple layers to build up a deeper shadow for both of these boxes to be the value that we need them to be throughout this process. To get lighter shades of green, I'm going to put water in the tray next to our colors, and I'm going to use like a paint palette to mix the green pigment with some water to lay down the layers and foundation for the lighter shades of green. If you go over these and they end up being too dark, a pretty neat way to get them to get lighter is to take your tissue paper and dab or dot or blot the box that you need to lighten and then leave it alone. I'm establishing a really light green here using water mixed with the pigment to give it a nice light shade of green. Again, you don't want to go too dark too soon when you're using watercolor because it is hard to pick up the pigment if you're already putting down a dark shadow. If you're working light in watercolor, you can always layer to make it darker. So you want to work light to dark when doing watercolor. The third box from the left, I want to have a little bit of a darker shade moving forward, so I'm using water and mixing it with the pigment. I don't want to get it too dark right away, so I'm going to go ahead and also just work with some of the green on the left and pull it over so we can establish it to be a little bit darker green as we move through the value scale. We don't want to apply too much water, otherwise the colors will all blend together and we can't layer them to make a nice value scale like this one. So I'm going to go ahead and pause and let this dry completely before I start working more layers. When this layer has dried, I'm going to go back and I'm going to start to darken the left side of the value scale to make this the darkest green. I'm putting my paintbrush in the paint and then I'm testing to see what it looks like up on some paper. And I don't want it to be too watery. We want to make sure that this layer is much more pigment than water. Otherwise, it will soak up into the paper and blend into the other areas, especially if they're still damp. And if we just keep applying water, that won't change the value. We need this to be more pigment than water when we want the color to stand out more. The trick is not necessarily the application with pressure of your paintbrush, it's how much water you're putting with the pigment to get the value. So each layer, I'm going back and adding just one more coat or layer of that same value we did last time. So for this, I added water to my mixing tray and then a little bit of pigment, and then I'm applying it on top of the layer that I'm working with. After that layer has dried, then you can go back and you can apply for your shadow of your green. You need a couple more layers to make it super dark. I'm going to try to get as much pigment as possible. This layer has to be all the way dry, so we're using not that much water. And if you have too much water inside your brush, you can always dab it on your Kleenex or tissue or wipe it off on the paper above, kind of testing and getting rid of that excess water before you put it in the box like I did previously. I know that I can get that green to be even darker on the left, so I'm going to go ahead and apply the same value to the next box in this green scale to darken that value. And so that when this layer dries, I can go back to the box on the left and add some more green to make it even more darker. So we're going to go ahead and let this layer dry, and then once it's dried, you need to check the left shadows and make sure that the very last box is the darkest, and you can go back in with one more layer if you want to make that green the darkest green if necessary. Next, we're going to do a value scale that combines green and black so that we can have an even bigger range of value, and it looks like we have even more realistic shadows as we're moving through our gradient of value. So let's go ahead and draw our value scale. And we're going to be layering from left to right, black and green, taking turns, letting them dry, and applying multiple layers to build up this value scale. So grab your paintbrush. We're going to get it in the water, clean it all the way off, and we're going to start with black. We want a lot of pigment, but not too much right away. So a little bit of water, a little bit of black pigment, and then I'm getting some of the pigment out so I can drag it through the value scale and establish a nice layer for the medium shades of black moving from the left to the right. I can use water to blend out the pigment that I have so it's not too dark. And this way I can work with layering and not lock myself in with super dark shades immediately and have to redo the value scale completely. I'm going to take some green and I'm going to apply water and apply it just underneath to set up a layering on top of the black and also start establishing what my green layer is going to look like. You could layer green right on top of the black. However, we just applied black with a lot of water, so it would bleed into each other and it wouldn't really establish a true value scale. It would just be a blackish greenish color going all the way through the boxes. So again, we don't want to do too much right away. I got some water. I have some green pigment. I'm trying to get less water and get more of the green pigment so I can apply this while we're waiting for this to dry back up to my other value scale because it was really bothering me and I wanted to pump up that dark green so that the gradient looked so much more smooth from the dark green to the medium greens and the lighter greens until we reach the highlight on that value scale above. So at this point, I'm just sticking my paintbrush back in the watercolor, just dabbing it really gently, trying not to go back into the water, but getting as much pigment as possible on my brush so that I can use that pigment and really build up this last layer of shadow on this green. And the scale underneath is pretty wet, so I'm gonna go ahead and take a break, let it sit and dry completely, and then we can come back and apply the rest of the layers. So I was having some technical difficulties and I missed filming applying a nice green even wash over the black layer that was applied. And so I took water, dipped it in green, and had a really medium shade of green applied on top of the black, and then I let that dry. And after you've done that, now we're going to go back in with our green and we're going to use lots of pigment and not much water, and we want to establish darker shades of green on the left. And this is going to take quite a bit of layering. Remember, we're doing this after our black layer has dried and the green wash has dried, and now we're going back in with our green pigment on top of the far left, the second from the left, and then the third from the left. When I'm just trying to get the pigment, I wanted to share that you just need to slightly dip your brush into the water, not dunk it all the way, just a really quick dip into the water. And anytime you have too much water, you can always wipe off the excess on your brush or the paper, and then use the rest of the pigment application to have a nice wash, a nice layer on top of the box that you need it to be. We have a pretty good transition going from our dark green shadow to medium shadows to lighter greens to super light green to white. However, we are not done just yet. We have one more thing to do. We are going to make this value scale have a higher contrast by applying some water to our brush. We're going to dip it in the black pigment and apply a medium gray to this second box from the left, and then we're going to apply the same gray to the left box where the deepest, darkest green shadow would be. And this is going to finish our value scale. It made that green so much darker, it gave us the correct shadow, and we have a higher contrast moving from the left to the right. So there it is. We completed it.